Continuing with the previous one, though Mr. Jacquemont was just a traveler to India, he is not supposed to know the very depth of the things. However, continuing from the previous one on page 48, we continue. How Ranjit Singh acquired his power and the method of government of the country. He writes, despite his white beard, Ranjit Singh is only 51. At the beginning of his career, he was only a Sardar with a following of 400 to 500 horsemen. The Punjab at that time was in a continual state of anarchy, owing to the local wars between the Sardars and periodical invasions of Shah Zaman, who came down with large armies from Kabul to attack Delhi. By his skill and ability, Ranjit soon made himself a reputation among the Sardars at that period. He invaded all the territories bordering on his own and kept them in possession, pillaging the more distant districts on which he fell unexpectedly with a handful of men. Negotiating with some, overcoming others by treachery. Thus his rule and his influence increased. Generous to those who shared his dangers, he created a loyal and faithful army. When Shah Zaman embarked on his last expedition to India in 1801, he advanced to Lahore, where a large number of Sikh Sardars attended his darbar and recognized his authority. Soon the Shah was recalled to his own country by internal troubles. He left Lahore in a hurry and in crossing the Ravi lost several cannons. Ranjit offered to recover these from the river, and for promise of this service and for others he went to Shah Zaman on his retreat. That prince surrendered to him his Lahore possessions, which Ranjit occupied without a struggle and with a sort of legitimate right. Then commenced his supremacy over all other Sikh chiefs, whom he dispossessed without much resistance, putting in their place soldiers of fortune whom he chose from among his former companions. When the Kabul monarchy broke up, one of the Afghan parties sought his aid in an attack on Kashmir, then held by the opposing party. Ranjit assisted but kept the conquered province for himself. Then he occupied the province of Multan, part of dominion of Nawab of Bahawalpur, whom he could not attack in his capital on the left bank of Sutlej, which the British had by Treaty 1809 fixed as the limit of his conquest in future, but whom he could easily dispossess of some districts or other banks of the river. Lastly, he crossed the Indus, seized Dera Ghazi Khan, and only evacuated it on the condition of receiving a yearly tribute. Latterly, he crossed the Indus at Attock and invaded the district of Peshawar and brought it under control and carried out the conquest of the mountainous states on the western side of Himalaya between the Sutlej and the Indus. His revenue in cash is about 3 crore of rupees, but in addition to this he receives a great deal in kind contribution of horses, camels, cloth, grain, and lastly of soldiers, which all the petty rajas of his creation have to supply in case of war. It is difficult to estimate the value of all this, and it is equally difficult to estimate his expenses. They certainly do not amount to half his revenue. He has amassed treasure and probably has about 8 crores locked up in his palace at Lahore. For some years, avarice has been his ruling passion. He governs as he feels inclined, and there are no fixed rules. There are no divisions into public departments and no specialization. He makes the so-called ministers do one thing one day, another day. He receives no account from his finance officers. Each one has to remit a certain amount of revenue. If it is not paid at once, the Raja regulates the balance of payment as he wishes. If it is not paid, the offender is whipped but there are other forms of torture used. He often has revenue officers who appear to him dishonest whipped in the darbar by his grooms. Ranjit is a Jat by descent. He has taken no other title since his elevation and is content with his own name, but allows no one else to bear it, which has led to a good deal of rebaptizing, for it is a common name among the Sikhs. He has all the dislike of an upstart for what one would call the old aristocracy of Punjab. Those of the old Sardars whom he has not expelled are heavily taxed, but all the courtiers and generals and Raja whom he has created in place of the former ones were once simple troopers in his army. Some have been promoted for their bravery and others for their good looks and manners. Such is the origin of fortune of Raja Dhyan Singh and his brother Gulab Singh. However, nothing might be lacking to the dignity of his new aristocracy. He compelled the old nobility to give them their daughters in marriage. His favourites, however, are not exempt from his cupidity. If he is displeased with them in any way, he finds them in proportion to their fortune, half a lakh, a lakh, or 2 lakhs, and sometimes only a few thousand rupees. These fines are always paid to him promptly and secretly to avoid the consequent loss of credit among the other courtiers which would follow if their disgrace became known. Among his most intimate counsellors are 3 Mohammedan brothers who conceal their wealth under an outward appearance of poverty and seek to atone for their intrusion by the humility of their behavior. All of them bear the title of Fakir, as do their sons. They know Arabic and have read the medical books written in that language, hence their reputation for deep scientific knowledge. The eldest, whom I met near Amritsar, is more or less the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It is he who writes all dispatches from Ranjit to the British government. Another is a trusted agent in Govindgarh. The third, whom I meet every day, is sometimes appointed governor of the city when Ranjit does not take him away with him. These brothers have devised a cipher which they use in correspondence among themselves, and this artifice, hitherto, I believe, unknown in the East, gives them a repute of great cleverness. Ranjit always punishes most of the crimes which come to his notice by fines. One man kills another, either deliberately or by accident. The Raja fines him rupees 1,000 or 2,000, and if he cannot pay, his family will have to do so. Ranjit's avarice makes him extremely averse to dispersing any of his hoard, and he only draws money from the treasury to pay his troops and to make presents. The irregular and uncertain payments which his courtiers receive is made by Jagirs or by royal bonds on the state debtor, either defaulter or criminal who have been fined. These latter are collected without difficulty thanks to the right which their owners have of opposing those who have to discharge the debt. Ranjit rarely remains 15 days in the same place. His energy, which age has not lessened, and which now he has conquered all the territory that he can no longer find an outlet in war, is mainly expended in hunting. Every day he holds his darbar in the open air. Unless it is raining, he listens to and dictates correspondence with the provinces and passes orders of all description. He always has a dozen horses near him, saddled and bridled, and here and there in the open country round his camp little tents for his own use. He rises from his darbar when he feels inclined, mounts a horse, and sometimes gallops all day followed by his people, and stops wherever he chooses. His dinner, which is composed of a little rice and a quail or half a partridge with some fruit and sweetmeats, follows him everywhere. At 2 o'clock he often stops. A carpet is quickly spread on the ground, and he sits down and eats a small ration of opium, 3 or 4 grains. A circle is formed around him, and he passes the time in conversation and transacting fresh business. It is always at this afternoon darbar that I have seen him. I should have found him less lively and less talkative in the morning before he had taken the opium. He never gives order beforehand as to who is to accompany him on his tours. He only warns the French officers. Messrs. Allard and Ventura had the boldness to teach him a lesson over this early in their service. They took no notice of his departure and stayed where they were with all their troops. Sometimes he takes out thousands of men hunting, and nearly always after tiger. Sometimes he shoots the latter from an elephant, or else attacks them on the horseback with a sword. His passion for horses permits his courtiers to keeping good ones, for he promptly takes them, though he does not pay for them. His last campaigns in Peshawar was fought over a possession of a horse and cost him several million of rupees. Ranjit's regular infantry numbers about 20 to 24,000 men. He has tried to raise cavalry regiments also on several occasions, but there are nominally 4 such in the army. But they are very inferior in every way to the company's irregular regiments, such as those of Colonel Skimmer. He has never been able to make up his mind to bear the expenses which a good cavalry regiment on European line involves, and while his avarice deprives him of such troops, he continues to give enormous pay to some of his old irregular troopers. Some of them get more than 1,000 a month, and no one of them gets less than 500. His so-called regular cavalry gets 28 rupees a month, and the men have to arm, equip, mount, and keep themselves and their chargers. This would be 8 rupees more than is the practice to give to irregular cavalry in British India if the men got it regularly. But the whole army only gets 10 months' pay a year, and that is very irregularly paid. Pay is always 4, 5, or 6 months in arrears, sometimes a year, or 14 months, particularly in case of cavalry. The result is that the latter are very much in debt, and when they receive orders of transfer, they sometimes refuse to march, for it is impossible for them to subsist on the march, and in new places they are unknown to the merchants and cannot obtain credit. The infantry gets rupees 7 a month, but there are deductions for clothing and arms which are uniform, and also for messing, an unusual thing in India. The prejudices of the Sikhs must be far less than those of Hindus for Ranjit to have been able to introduce such a practice into his army. His company of 100 men has 4 cooks who prepare the meal. Each man receives his ration in a bowl and eats separately. Hardly a year passes without a mutiny caused by the pay being in arrears. The Raja compromises with the mutineer, often recalls them by generous promise, and has the ringleader whipped, and punishes everybody by a fine of 1 or 2 months' pay. When he has made 2,000 or 3,000 rupees in this way, he boasts of it in Darbar as a good stroke of business. Except in winter, the infantry are clothed in tight white trousers, a white jacket, and a little blue turban. They are armed with a sword and a flintlock with a bayonet, and in line they make very good show. In winter they wear a uniform of red cloth like the British sepoys, but this more expensive uniform is rarely renewed. Some Mussalman corps and those composed of what are called the Purbis in the Punjab, that is to say Hindus from the other side of Satluj, most of them are deserters, wear a shaku. The Sikh would rather die than wear such a headdress. There is no regular rule as to the officer's pay. One captain may get only rupees 28 or rupees 30 a month, another 40, some as much as 50 or 60. The Raja gives some colonels as much as 50 rupees a day, while others get only rupees 10 or 12. The senior officers are paid even more irregularly than the soldiers. Nevertheless, such is the taste of arms among the Sikhs that Ranjit would have no difficulty in getting recruits to expand his army to 80,000 at once. So far, military rank has not been a matter of purchase, but there is such a demand for service and promotion that buyers would be plentiful. Allard and Ventura persuaded him to create a military decoration, but he soon made it so cheap that they got him to suppress it. Ranjit's chief deficiency is artillery. He is very proud of the number of his guns, but they are very inferior pieces and are wretchedly mounted and served. All are of different calibers, thus each has its own shot which cannot be used for any of the others. These shots are of cast iron and very rough. The guns are much heavier than those of twice the caliber in Europe, yet they are worn out after a few discharges. They are cast in a mold without being bored. The arsenal of this miserable artillery is in Raja's own palace. There are also the muskets of infantry are made and repaired. They are equally bad and often burst in the soldier's hand. Such is the temper of the Sikhs that cartridges are carefully taken away from the soldiers except in action or when used for practice. Even the flints are removed from the musket. I gather that otherwise there will be continual cases of men shooting each other or actual units fighting among themselves. They are like hunting leopards, which are taken out hunting in an iron cage and only released when the game is in sight. I was wrong when I mentioned earlier that Ranjit had formed several regiments of Akalis, which he has used against the Sayyid. Sayyid means Sayyid Ahmad Shahid. They are quite uncontrollable, and the only way to deal with them is to exterminate them. After Amritsar, their favorite headquarters is Lahore. One sees them chiefly on the outskirts of the city among the ruins of the Mughal palaces and mosques. This is their lair. Nearly all of them are mounted on ponies and armed with spear and matchlock. Others have only a bow or a sword. They are dressed in tattered blue clothes, and most of them wear a long pointed headdress of the same color, surrounded at its base with a polished steel ring like a brim of a hat. They are hideous to behold. They live on what they can take if it is not given to them, and hurl insults at those whom they dare not plunder. Allard, who has wisely made them friendly by his liberality, has nevertheless on occasion been attacked by them with showers of stones, and in the course of my excursions round the city I have several times been threatened by them. But for my escort I should have been obliged to beat a hasty retreat. Sometimes they collect in parties of hundreds and mingle among the Raja's attendants, and when they think themselves strong enough, they threaten him and demand money. They have more than once held him up for ransom in this way, but Ranjit has never ventured to take rigorous measures against them. When a campaign takes place, he urges them to go on active service and gives a general order to put them in a position from which they have little chance of returning, and they usually come back in smaller numbers, for they fight with desperate courage. During the last days of my stay in Lahore, he ventured for the first time to expel them from that city and its suburbs. After my farewell interview, he crossed the Ravi to go hunting 20 miles away. When he was safely across the river, he sent orders to the Sikh general, who shares with Allard and Ventura the command of the regular troops, to clear the Akalis out of their haunts and drive them back to Amritsar. Each nest of them was surprised by such a force. The resistance was impossible. However, they put up a fight, and some 20 of them were killed. It will be the same way as ever in a few months. Though Ranjit is more or less of a skeptic, this does not prevent him from being extremely superstitious. The fact that he rises whenever a descendant of Guru Nanak approaches him, and that he goes twice a year to bathe in the sacred pool in Amritsar, is merely a political demonstration to satisfy popular superstition. But he has invented devotions of his own, which are regarded by the Sikhs with indifference, if not displeasure. For example, he makes pilgrimages to the tombs of the celebrated Mohammedan saints and give them considerable presents, of which charity is certainly not the motive, and he often mutters prayers which are unintelligible to everyone else. I have seen him in Darbar listening but distracted, and when he should have replied, silent and self-absorbed, his lips moved and his courtiers said that he was communing with his spirit. He hates the idea of death, and word is never mentioned in his presence when it is no longer possible to conceal from him the death of one whom he has known well, particularly one of his companions of his youth. It is stated that he has gone away. The Raja knows what it means, makes a grimace, and never alludes to the matter again. It is probably the same religious idea which prevents his passing a death sentence. It is certainly not humanity. Once when crossing the Indus, a lord saw him laughing and joking while seeing a number of people drowned and their corses washed away by the river. I believe for all this he believes in the devil and serves him like a Jesuit. One knows that Orientals are debauched, but they have some shame about it. Ranjit's excesses are shameless. The fact that this greybeard has had and has a number of catamites is nothing shocking in this country. But apart from this, he has always consorted publicly with women of the bazaar, whose patron and protector he is. At great festivals, there are hundreds of them at Lahore and Amritsar, whom he makes them dress up as Amazons in the most ridiculous way, ride on horses and follow him. On such occasions, they form his bodyguard. He always has some of them in his camp, and they follow him everywhere riding upon elephants. One of his pastimes, when he has nothing better to do, is to watch their flirtation with young men of his court. In his youth, he was passionately in love with one of these women. She had to be always near him. The inhabitants of Lahore saw him 100 times in those days, sitting with her on an elephant and toying with her as though in the zanana, and in broad daylight surrounded by a large escort and talking and laughing with them all the time. The Sikhs have a horror of tobacco. A Mussalman would never smoke in Punjab in front of a respectable Sikh. The woman who had such influence over Raja smoked in the presence of his howdah, and he even assisted her to light her hookah, probably the most outrageous exhibition he has made in Lahore. Ranjit has two sons. The elder, Karak Singh, is 26 or 28 and is very like his father to look at, but is very feeble-minded. The other, Sher Singh, is less than 20 and is not at all like his father, but is very intelligent. Both are now in the north campaigning against the Sayyid. It is likely that the Sikh monarchy will end with the death of Ranjit. The two princes will undoubtedly fight for the throne, and great Jagirdar will rise to assert their independence. If in the confusion that ensues, any cavalry passes the Satluj to plunder the villages in Patiala, this will certainly be a pretext for the British to invade the Punjab and illegitimate one. The Raja is quite indifferent as to what will happen after his death and takes no measure to ensure a continuance of order. His wives and his sons have Jagirs and, like everyone else, are exposed to his avarice. 2 years ago, he was vain enough to marry two young daughters of Raja of Kangra, whom he had just dispossessed of his territory. These children are now 12 or 13. When their old important husband dies, these poor children will be obliged to burn themselves with the corpse of their husband. Their family is a high-caste one, and the rule is rigid in their case. Otherwise, satis are rare in Punjab. Allard told me of one he witnessed at Lahore. The procession in the middle of which the victim walked made a terrible uproar. But the sati seemed to have retained all her composure. She lays down herself on the pyre and removes her ornaments, which she distributed among her round others. She distributes the ornaments, and when she has finished, she picks out the most comfortable position, getting up several times to alter the position of the logs of wood which were not comfortable. When she was at ease, she had herself covered carefully with more logs. Then they threw a quantity of oil on the pyre in which she had buried herself, and the fire was applied, blazed up with such violence that she must have suffocated at once. It is clear that the Indians have no pity for satis. The philosopher Babus of Calcutta, who will pretend to be sorry for them, have learned this from us and only do so by way of imitation. The prospect of pyres before the women of this country all through their lives. It appears to them a natural necessity in which they must take their part, just as we naturally look forward to the dying of the disease. It is true that we do not know when the death will come, but these women know all their lives that one day they will have to face it, and when the actual moment comes, they already have foreseen almost all the horror of it. The position of Europeans in the service of Ranjit Singh gives no one from the British India any cause for envy. The pecuniary advantage which they enjoyed are not sufficient, in my opinion, to compensate for the disagreeable necessity of having to obey the orders of so capricious a ruler, and for the sake of their reputation they are obliged to live in too much luxury to be able to save anything. To keep them in the country, the Raja has taken care to make them possess a considerable stake in it, which they will lose completely when they leave the Punjab. This is their houses and their gardens, if he keeps them in the same condition of arrears as the rest of the army. He owes a lakh to Allard and Ventura, the two officers he is most anxious to keep. Both would like to return to Europe. Allard is often talking of his age and breaking up of his health, but the Raja turns a deaf ear to these proposals and contents himself by saying that he will send him to Kashmir next year. Ranjit understands very imperfectly the relations of existing between different nations of Europe. On the strength of the long enmity between England and France, he was afraid, when Dr. Murray came to Amritsar to attend him, to let him approach the quarters of Allard for fear that they should fight. And one day, when Murray told him that he had received an invitation to dinner from that officer which he hoped to accept that evening, his astonishment was great. "Then you are not enemies," said the Raja to Murray, and the suspicion that he had always had of these officers was by no means lessened. He remained attached to them, however, because he has had the experience of their devotion and loyalty, and apparently taken no offence at their regular correspondence with Wade and Murray. From the friendly relations of French and British officers, he doubtless concludes that the British government will resent any ill treatment of the former, and Allard, who shares this idea, regards himself in a much safer position since the establishment of these regular communications. When Master Mevius was dismissed by the Raja, he paid him exactly what was due to him, made a little present in addition, and took from him not a receipt, but a sort of certificate that he has no cause of complaint, as if he were afraid that the Mevius will go up and complain to the British government, when the Raja would be able to clear himself by sending in his note. He has just extorted a similar statement from Mr. Harlan on the same condition of full payment and a little more addition. So this describes some of the situation. So this at length explains the kind of environment which existed at the time of Ranjit Singh. And it's an interesting kind of administration, I must say. Unfortunately, Mr. Jacquemont did not live long after these things, and he died of cholera at a very young age after this. But he has left us with these precious observations, although some of them are probably not correct. With this, I end this, and we will talk about Ranjit Singh and his politics a little more later on, and about the city of Lahore. Thank you very much for your patience.